Hello there. Thanks for spending a little time on my website this week. I'm Jim Brown. If you've joined us for the first time, I write a weekly column that appears in about 80 newspapers and websites throughout Louisiana, primarily, although other websites throughout the South. Do a radio program nationally on several hundred stations coast to coast, although I'm taking a little break right now from the radio show. I have a lot of traveling to do. I've got a new book coming out, and I'll have that book information for you in about a week. So taking a little time from the radio show, be back on here this fall again. I've been doing that for about 15 years. So welcome to the site if you just joined us. Hope to check out my column this week, a very important column. Sometimes I'm a little whimsical, bring humor into it, but a very serious column this week about the uncivility in our country today. I'm deeply concerned about it, as are a number of people. The lines have been drawn in the dirt. The R's are in this direction, the D's in another direction, and you just can't get along. We're in a time of confrontational politics. The best example of that was the Democratic debate, the first debate that took place about 2 weeks ago, where candidates got up on the stage trying to be the future wannabe and digging into a number of issues that happened in the past. Joe Biden was the blunt of a lot of that criticism. He's leading the race from the Democratic field right now. Name recognition, former vice president, that would be expected. But he was castigated on some of his views that really concerned me. One was he said that even though he might disagree politically with members of the U.S. Senate when he was a member, you might remember that Biden was the youngest U.S. senator I think we've elected before he could even take office, and then was sworn in after he took office. Very tragic, by the way, if you don't know the Biden story. Biden was elected as U.S. senator. Before he took office, his wife and his daughter were killed in a very tragic automobile accident. He was very distraught. He lives up in Delaware, several hours from Washington, D.C., told his friends he would not even take office, had two more sons that he had to raise, and he wasn't going to take office. Well, they convinced him, look, you've got to take office. And what he did, quite admirably, quite frankly, was commute. He didn't live in Washington, D.C. He took the 2-hour train each way, each day, so he could be home to raise those boys back up in Delaware. Very commendable. But he said that when he was young like that, he had to deal with U.S. senators of a different persuasion. Southern senators at the time obviously had a segregationist bent against the civil rights law, for example, that took place. And in that time, there was a lot of differences of opinion over the future of where this country should go. And he said that even though he might have sharply disagreed, he still was civil and tried to work across the aisle. And some candidates thought that was outrageous. I think Kamala Harris and several of the other Democratic wannabes thought that you just don't cooperate. That's just not right. It plays up the fact that being politically correct is a lot more important than try to confect some type of middle ground, some type of a solution orientation. I can identify with that. I was a very young state senator back in 1971 when I was elected in Louisiana. I was one of the youngest state senators that went to the state capitol in Baton Rouge. And as things developed, I was surrounded by a bunch of older senators, some who had been back in the 60s and had voted for segregationist legislation. I wasn't of that persuasion. I was a Democrat at the time. I'm an independent now, but I had a strong base of African Americans and a cross section of other people that I was there to represent. Well, I disagreed and voted opposite to those senators on a number of pieces of legislation. But we didn't become uncivil. I didn't ignore them. When the day was over, we went out and broke bread, had a meal, visited, got to know each other. I knew about their children, their families, and we were able to find some middle ground on issues that maybe normally they wouldn't have taken that middle ground on. And by the way, I know that Biden was also criticized because he said, I think Senator Eastland from Mississippi called him son, didn't call him boy, that called him son. I can tell you this from my personal experience. I was called both boy and son by senators when I was elected in 1972. I didn't take it personally. I was kind of a young guy, wet behind the ears. And particularly then, seniority was much more important. Not as important today, the rules have changed. But back then, you just were supposed to spend your first time kind of quietly in the background. I often ventured out of that parameter. Senator Mike O'Keefe, who was the president of the Senate then, allowed me to do so. But often I was cracked back by one of these other senators saying, "You're going too far, boy," or "son," or "young Jim," "wet behind the ears Brown." I had a number of nicknames. I didn't look on that as racial. I don't think they were coming from a racial perspective. That's just how they treated a young guy like me. And I thought that's just part of dealing with this cantankerous legislature, some at least. And I had to deal with that, and I did. And quite frankly, I'm very proud of my record as a senator, because I think I made a lot of progress. Joe Biden will say the same thing, I think. He made a lot of progress. And that attitude made him vice president of the United States. So he had to be on some positive track. So anyway, I shared that with you. I had a great anecdote in my column this week. I hope you read about my friend Dutch Morial. Dutch Morial broke so many barriers in politics in Louisiana. He was the first African-American legislator, the first judge, Court of Appeals judge, the first African-American mayor of the city of New Orleans, and went on to break any number of barriers. After he served 2 times in the Senate, and I'd finished my term as Secretary of State and an unsuccessful run for governor, Dutch Morial and I practiced law together. And he relished in telling a great story about a very conservative legislator that was his seatmate. I'm not going to tell you the story now. I want you to read it in the column. So civility is important. I think if you're going to, and I can understand some of the confrontation today. We're in a time of apprehension, quite frankly, where people are uncertain about those around them. They're not comfortable with some of the changes that are taking place. Maybe they've lost their jobs that go overseas. There's a lot of apprehension in this country from the lower middle class and on down. And I can understand that. And sometimes that breeds some resentment. And legislators pick up on that and can be uncivil because of that reason. But that's not doing your job. That's not in the public interest. Your job is to go down and find solutions to a whole list of problems we have in this country. And we have the states like my home state of Louisiana. Read that column and see what you think. And I'll be glad to hear from you. My information is here on the site, and I hope you'll tune in regularly, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for watching this week.